Hi, this is Brent Johnson with Santiago Capital. It's now July 2018, and while this year has already been a memorable one, I think the next 6 months will be even more pressure-packed than the first 6. So I hope you're having a nice summer, and that as you either read this letter or listen to this presentation, you're doing so somewhere with a nice blue sky and maybe even some sand between your toes. Now, a couple of notes before we get started. I'm going to refer from time to time to my last update in January, as well as a recent interview I did in May. I won't have time to go into those in great detail again, but if you need a refresher, just let me know and I'm happy to send those links to you. I'm also maybe not going to have time to go through every slide that I show you today in great detail. I may need to skip over a few of them very fast. If you'd like to review them in more detail, just let me know. I'm happy to send them to you, and you can also use the pause button as you listen to the presentation. So as I noted in our last update in January, gold made a furious rally to end 2017. And threatening to definitively break out of a channel it had been traversing for the last 5 years. At the time, we said we were a little bit skeptical and not yet convinced it was gold's moment, and that it had some significant resistance to get through. But there were several catalysts coming up that could very easily send it to breakout territory, whether it was Trump's showdown with Rocket Man, whether his ongoing showdown with Mueller and the never-ending Russia collusion story, to the 10% sell-off at the beginning of February for the S&P 500, which was accompanied by a huge spike in volatility to go with it. Many felt it was finally gold's time to shine. But by the end of Q2, Trump and Rocket Man were friends and shaking hands in Singapore. And despite the Russia, Russia, Russia narrative, Trump was still in the White House. Volatility had fallen back to the low teens and seemed to be taking a long spring break and maybe even an extended summer vacation. And as a result, the S&P 500 had rebounded and was now positive for the year. And as we expected, despite a fantastic opportunity to put the bear market behind it for good, gold pulled back from resistance and is now back inside its 5-year channel. In fact, it has now fallen almost 10% from the April highs. The primary reason for gold's pullback is the one we highlighted in our January update, the strong dollar. Despite many calling for it to fall into the low 80s in January and February, it put in a bottom and has rallied 7% since March and now sits in the mid-90s. There are several reasons for this rally, and while I don't have time to review my entire strong dollar thesis here, it is centered around the fact that the Federal Reserve has been raising rates. This divergence of monetary policy, basically by swapping out its liquidity syringe for a straw, has dramatic implications for the global economy. Long story short, whoever has the straw gets to drink the monetary milkshake that the central banks of the world have been making. And since we are the only ones with a straw, the dollar is going to get big and fat and go much, much higher as it sucks in liquidity from around the globe. This strong dollar will act as the first domino, which will start a chain reaction of knock-on effects that many, quite frankly, are not prepared for. And even many who are prepared for it are not likely to get the knock-on effects right. Because the dollar strength will see not only interest rates and the dollar rise, but I believe U.S. equities as well, all at the expense of the world as they go through a very painful deleveraging. Now, I keep talking about straws and syringes. What did these have to do with economics, global finance, and capital markets? Well, they both deal with using pressure to either push or pull liquids through tubes and channels. In other words, we're talking about hydraulics, which is a branch of science that deals specifically with the practical applications of putting liquids under pressure. And while their design is very simple, straws and syringes are extremely powerful hydraulic systems. This is because of Pascal's law, which says that when you put any point on a body of liquid under pressure, that pressure is transmitted undiminished to all points in the fluid. Without going into too much more detail, this allows us to transmit a small amount of force into an incredible amount of force by putting liquids under pressure. This principle is used every day in hundreds of different functions and industries, from dump trucks, fire hoses, forklifts, injection molding systems, and airplane wings. And anyone who has ever squeezed a tube of toothpaste or put their thumb over the end of a garden hose in order to spray someone has, whether they realize it or not, used Pascal's law to their benefit. Okay, so that explains just how syringes and straws work, but what in the heck does it mean for economics and finance? Well, it actually has a lot to do with it. Because while you may not know it, there are pipes, tubes, and hoses behind the floors, ceilings, and walls of just about every building and piece of infrastructure in our modern-day society. And there are pipes, tubes, and hoses behind the facade of the global monetary system as well. While we don't really think of them as such, There is a system through which capital flows. There are channels by which money, or liquidity, gets from one side of town to the other side of town, and from one side of the world to the other side of the world. This is a diagram of the U.S. payment system, but since the dollar is the world reserve currency and everyone uses it for trade, all nations wanting to use dollars for trade need to abide by this design. These pipes and tubes are largely controlled by the United States, specifically by the Treasury, Federal Reserve, and the large U.S. clearinghouse banks. They do this by controlling the dollar payment system via the Office of Foreign Asset Control, the Committee on Foreign Investments, and the dollar chips and SWIFT systems. And if they want to, the U.S. institutions that control this plumbing can kick you out of the system. You need look no further than Russia and Iran, who have both found themselves on the outside of this system at various points over the last decade. And while there are certain workarounds, they are not cheap, they are not efficient, and they don't typically lead to being invited back into the system. Now, so far we've just talked about the plumbing, but the fiat money that flows through these pipes also has its own design. And one of the hallmarks in the design of the debt-based fiat money is that it's an exponential system. This means it has to grow, and anything that constantly grows eventually goes exponential. And the problem with exponential systems is that they always eventually crash. It's just simple math. The other problem is that the system is designed around a single global reserve currency. This means that all countries participating in global trade, for the most part, use the currency of the country deemed to be the global reserve, or in our case, it's currently the dollar. To further complicate it, the Giffen dilemma shows that inevitably a conflict arises when the reserve currency puts domestic needs ahead of the needs of the international community who are badly in need of said reserve currency. And to top it all off, we have a president who says he's going to make America great again, and a Fed chair who says it's not our job to solve the rest of the world's problems. In other words, something's going to break. Because if the dollar is not supplied in sufficient quantity, then the flow of capital stops and the system breaks. And that's where we find ourselves today. The global monetary system, the tubes, the pipes, and the channels are under tremendous pressure. Liquidity is getting squeezed, and the system is starting to crack. And this leads to two essential commodities that you've probably heard me talk a lot about: dollars and gold. In some ways they are very similar, and in other ways they could not be more different. An iconic monetary duo that often be seen as competitors rather than collaborators. Only very, very rarely do you see them share the same stage. But considering what we are going to go through over the next few years, I'm not sure if there could be two more important components to an investor's portfolio. And as I was thinking about this iconic duo, I was reminded of another. So switching gears back to the 1970s and the early 1980s, Queen was one of the most popular bands in the entire world. A few of their songs, We Are the Champions, We Will Rock You, Another One Bites the Dust, are still staple anthems of just about every major sporting event you can imagine. They were led by one of the most powerful singers in the history of rock and roll. It was this guy right here. Born in Zanzibar, he grew up in India and then England, and his name was Farrokh Bulsara, otherwise known as Freddie Mercury. And if you've ever heard Freddie Mercury sing, my guess is you haven't forgotten it. Freddie lived about as large as possible. Big, brash, overbearing. He wasn't just a star, he was a legend, and he knew it. The city of Montreux, Switzerland agreed, and on its promenade along the shores of Lake Geneva, a statue of him stands there to this day. But why Switzerland? Well, it just so happens that Freddie and Queen owned their own recording studio in Montreux. Bordered by the lake to the west and the rolling Swiss countryside to the north, and the heart of the Alps to the east and the south, Montreux, Switzerland is so painfully beautiful that it almost hurts to look at it. And they felt this was a great place to quietly work on their new music. And in the September of 1981, after finishing a global tour, Queen retreated to Montreux to start tinkering on their next album. As it turned out, their friend David Jones happened to have a house not too far from their studio. And he happened to be in town. And he also happened to be somewhat of a musician himself. Now, of course, no one has ever heard of David Jones. But my guess is you might have heard of his real name, or his pen name, is David Bowie. Now, Bowie was not just a musician. He was an artist in the truest sense of the word. He drew, he painted, he sculpted, he wrote books and plays. He was not just the star man, but he also starred in movies and even cartoons. He reinvented himself numerous times. If ever you could call anyone a modern-day artistic polymath, it was him. And how can you not just love a guy who turned down a knighthood, not just once, but on 2 separate occasions, because of how silly the whole thing is? In any case, Bowie dropped by the studio where Queen and Freddie were rehearsing, and they all started jamming. Then, after going to dinner, imbibing some fermented liquidity, and God knows what other substances, they came back and hammered out a song that was quite possibly the most recognizable bass line in history, and in my opinion, one of the greatest songs ever written. Yep, Under Pressure. Like the name suggests, it was written in one crazy evening with tension and fighting galore. I won't tell the whole story here, but if you're at all interested, I recommend you Google it. Now, I'm not alone in my adoration of this song. It is widely regarded as a masterpiece, and Rolling Stone named it the #1 duet of all time. One article described it as an apocalyptic cry of both fear and empathy. And with lyrics like these, it's as relevant today as it was almost 50 years ago. In fact, unless there's any strong objections, I'm declaring this the anthem of our time. Because everyone, and I mean everyone, is under pressure right now. Now, of course, there are always those who want to dethrone the king. And if they can't do it of their own accord, they don't mind doing it by less than scrupulous means. And over the years, there have been many potential alternatives who have either tried to be or have been believed to be the heir apparent to the global reserve currency. But the reality is, just like Vanilla Ice, who captured the world's attention for a brief moment, these are just pretenders. The dollar is still the king. And due to the way the plumbing of the monetary system is set up, and due to the many problems elsewhere in the world, liquidity is going to get squeezed into the dollar. These capital flows will not just find their way into the dollar, but into dollar-denominated assets as well. This will mean the Trump administration will be able to fund its significant budget deficits. It means the Fed will be able to continue to raise rates. It means unemployment will stay low, and that the benign circle that this creates will mean that equities will not just rise, but give us a blow-off top that may even shock the equity bulls. I know there are lots of people who just can't believe this, but those are not the people who continue to plow foreign direct investment into the U.S. year after year, and this has shown no signs of receding. It's not from our biggest competitors who not only continue to use the dollar for trade, but are sending their profits here to build plants and equipment. And it's not the international corporations who are buying our domestic companies at record pace. But despite these headlines, there are many very, very smart people out there who just cannot get their head around the idea of the dollar strengthening. But before we focus on why the money will come here, let's consider the other options. As my friend Keith posed a great question to these dollar bears a few weeks ago, and that is, if not to the dollar, where will the capital go? After all, for the dollar to crash, as many suggest, that means another asset class around the world has to receive these funds in tremendous size. The liquid has to go somewhere. Is it going to go to EM currencies? Let's look at how they've done versus the dollar recently. I mean, this is truly one ugly chart, with almost every EM currency down anywhere from 2 to 30% in just the last 3 months. This is not exactly an indication that people are rushing out to sell dollars in exchange for EM. These negative currency returns are largely a reflection of the massive dollar leverage these countries have taken out over the last few decades. Without the ability to print the currency necessary to reduce this leverage, and with the dollar on the rise, this is the very definition of funding pressure. Perhaps the dollar bears think that the capital will flow to the global bond market? Well, there's still $8 to $10 trillion worth of negative yielding bonds. How many of you would like the opportunity to lend money to a country or a corporation who won't actually pay you a dividend, but will instead charge you for the pleasure of giving your money to them? Is it going to flow into emerging market equities or emerging market debt? Not according to the recent info that shows funds crested last year and have decidedly headed south in 2018. And if we take a closer look at these equity markets in Asia and South America, with the exception of Japan, which is flat, they are all down anywhere from 8 to 15%. Does that look enticing to the typical asset allocator? These negative returns have led to capital leaving these very same markets it rushed into just 18 to 24 months ago. In fact, those flows have already been completely reversed in the first 6 months of 2018. And it's not just emerging markets. Almost every equity index in the world is down versus the S&P 500 this year. Whether it's France, Israel, Sweden, Hong Kong, China, or Japan, there's just pain everywhere you look. Perhaps the dollar bears think that despite the 7% pullback in the euro over the last 4 months, that it is destined to be the return beneficiary of capital leaving the dollar? Well, not if history is any indication, because for the last 10 years, the euro minus US economic surprise differential has been a very good indicator of where the euro will be, and it is decidedly looking for a further euro weakness ahead. But it's not just the fact that the economic factors like growth and inflation in the Eurozone have softened, leading to a more negative differential with the US and the dollar in the US markets. Draghi has no way to taper the ECB's bond purchases, while Merkel and Juncker are fighting for their lives, because coalitions from Italy, Spain, and Greece are continuing to put forth non-EU political goals. In other words, the fact that the euro and the EU itself is in perpetual crisis makes it hard to view as a destination from a storm. Whether due to immigration, banking system issues, sovereign debt issues, Brexit issues, or even having to perhaps fund their own share of NATO costs, the Eurozone is in constant crisis, and it's all downhill from here. So why am I spending so much time talking about all the problems around the world when the majority of our investments are found much closer to home? Because it means the dollar is going much higher, much, much higher. This is a long-term chart showing the dollar index all the way back to the early 80s when it made its high of 160. Now if we zoom into the last 15 years, we can see that it's in a rising wedge pattern where it's currently fluctuating between 80 and 100. Earlier in the year, many were calling for it to drop to the low 80s. But now that we've had a bounce, and even many of the most prominent dollar bears are open to the idea that it might rise to the top of this wedge and retest the $100 level. But this is where they expect it to stop before reversing and heading back to the lows. And while I agree it is heading to 100, and there may be a stop sign when we get there, this is where our agreement ends. Because I think the dollar is going to treat that 100 sign in the same way that a guy that just got a new Ferrari treats a stop sign. And once that stop sign is in the rearview mirror, there is absolutely no resistance keeping it from gunning for its all-time highs. And while this might sound crazy, and maybe even absurd, anyone who has ever been part of a vicious short squeeze will immediately recognize that crazy and absurd are not only not hard to come by during these types of times, but rather they are a key feature of the event itself. So why will the dollar go through a short squeeze? Mainly because despite all the protestations to the contrary, demand for dollars from several different sources is not only falling, it's actually rising. And this is happening while supply is no longer increasing, but rather falling. In other words, economics 101. The second reason is that rates will continue to rise, and that will only increase the attractiveness of the dollar. Now, the very first argument that everyone always gives me is that not only are rates not going to rise, but the Fed is under great pressure to rejoin the milkshake makers and increase the supply of dollars by returning to QE and lowering rates any minute now. To which I would say two things. First, other than people ranting about it on Twitter, there is absolutely no evidence of this. Most economic indicators are better now than when rate hikes first started. And second is that even if the pressure was there, it isn't going to happen anytime soon. Because by raising interest rates, the Fed has actually removed another form of pressure that all the other central banks are feeling, and that is the one to one day normalize policy. Not only that, but like we said earlier, by swapping out their syringe for a straw, the Fed is now enabling the US market to drink everyone else's milkshake. Now, if someone can explain to me why on earth Powell is suddenly under pressure to start injecting his own stimulus, when all he needs to do is sit back, talk nice and calmly, raise interest rates nice and slowly but surely, and steal the stimulus that everyone else is injecting, I'm all ears. It would be the stupidest thing he could do, and I don't think he's stupid. In fact, Powell might be something of an artistic thief in the same vein as David Bowie. When asked by Cameron Crowe if he considered himself an original thinker, Bowie responded, "Not by any means. more like a tasteful thief. The only art I'll ever study is stuff I can steal from. He went on to say that Mick Jagger was scared to walk into the same room of him with a new idea because Mick knew Bowie would steal it. And if you think central bankers are above such cutthroat tactics, I'm going to have to politely disagree with you, because there is no honor amongst thieves. And if you don't think central bankers are thieves, well, we're going to have to politely disagree again. The next argument I always hear is that Trump wants a low-rate environment, to which I would answer, well, good, because he's got it. It would be very hard to argue that federal funds at less than 2% is a high interest rate environment. Only an addict would argue otherwise. In fact, short rates could double from here and would still be below the long-term historical average. The second thing I would say regarding Trump wanting an easy monetary policy is that despite the consistent Fed raises over the last couple of years, is that it's actually still negative. Like this chart from Kevin Mears shows, the real level of federal funds is actually negative due to inflation. I mean, how much easier do you want? Finally, to those arguing Trump wants lower rates, I would suggest listening to this recent interview with Anthony Scaramucci, who for a very brief time serves as the White House communication director. Now, whatever you think of the mooch, and whatever you think of President Trump, I think it would be a real stretch to say that these two do not like each other. And as his communications director, I think it would be very hard to say that he was not in close contact and communication with Trump. And he says that Trump actually wants interest rates to be a little bit higher, because most of the people that voted for Trump don't own stocks and hedge funds. They have their money in a bank. And when he was on the campaign trail, they would all tell him how tough it was to not earn anything on their savings deposits and their CDs. Now you can dismiss this if you want, but I think there's a lot more truth here than many would care to admit. Now, as hard as it is to believe, literally as I was writing this a little bit ago, Trump has come out and said that he is not a fan of rate hikes. Big surprise. Which, while this does not exactly reinforce Scaramucci's point, it doesn't dismiss it either. Of course, the media and the markets have jumped all over this, as if Trump can wave his hand and automatically control the global market. But all he really said was that he wasn't a fan of higher rates because he didn't want it to undo the work he's done on trade and taxes. Well, as long as the markets hold up, which I'm convinced they will, these higher rates will just give Trump another card to play. Not only will he be able to complain about the tariffs that other countries are charging us, he'll also be able to say that we're suffering from a strong dollar. So it just gives him more ammunition. There are also those who will point out to our 20 trillion national debt and enormous budget deficits and say that this can in no way be paid off and that as a result no one will buy our debt going forward. Now, I'm very sympathetic to this view. They are of course correct in that it will never be paid off. And there will eventually be a piper that needs to be paid. There's no question about that. But here's the thing. All the other countries in the world that could provide a suitable alternative are in just as bad, if not worse shape than we are. In other words, the piper is coming for everyone. But until he arrives, it's a relative world. And on a relative basis, we look far better than the alternative. U.S. Treasuries enjoy a broad-based demand from both domestic and foreign investors. This year alone, they have issued $500 billion in Q1 and had zero trouble placing them, despite the Fed reducing their balance sheet. The next argument will be that China, Russia, and many other sovereign nations are sick of the dollar and will no longer fund us. Again, there's truth to this. Foreign entities are not buying our debt at the same extent they were a decade ago. But their declining ownership trend has been known and been happening for more than a few years, and everybody knows it. And our budget is now financed mostly by domestic entities anyway. And if the pension funds, insurance companies, and households were hungry to buy treasuries yielding 1.5% a couple years ago, I imagine they'll be just as happy earning 3% now. The next reason I'm constantly told that rates will not rise is because there are no signs of inflation and there's no reason for the Fed to overdo the raises. But if we look at this part from Paul Benjamin, it shows that consumer price inflation follows velocity of money very closely, with a lag of about 9 months. To which most people respond, yeah, but there's no velocity of money. But that's incorrect. While velocity of money is indeed low, it has risen for the last 9 months in a row. And when Q2 GDP numbers are finalized in a few weeks, it will have been 4 quarters in a row. That hasn't happened in almost 10 years. Now, of course, some people will say, yes, but it's only headline CPI which is rising. To which I would say again, that is wrong. There are several inflationary indicators that are all in an uptrend. not the least of which is the New York Fed's underlying inflation gauge, which is now the Fed's most preferred measure. Now you can dismiss these signs if you like, but they are right there for everyone to see. Next, many will say, but the banks still don't pay anything on deposits and they aren't lending either. That doesn't help the velocity of money. But that's changing as well. It's no longer uncommon to receive emails such as this one where banks are actively promoting higher rates. And we are getting back to levels where you cannot say that they're great, but at least they're not as embarrassing as they were just a year ago. And it's not just Ally Bank. Many banks are now actively competing for your deposits, and they are willing to pay up to get them. It's kind of crazy that I have to say this, but this is how capitalism is supposed to work. Rather than just accepting your business because they are subsidized by the government and you have no alternative, when companies are under pressure to actually compete for your business, the product improves. And this is happening because rates are no longer at the zero bound and are rising, not because they are headed lower. And think about this. Why do banks want deposits? Deposits are actually liabilities on bank balance sheets. So why do they want more of those? Well, they want more of those because they want to lend them out at a higher rate. I loved this tweet by Brian Brantley a month ago. He recognizes that this is a sign of capitalism. This is a sign that banks are now competing for your dollars. And the only reason they would pay up for your deposits is if they think they can lend them out at an even higher rate. If they didn't think they could lend them out at a higher rate, then they would not be paying up for your deposits to begin with. They would be lowering rates. The zero bound on interest rates is like capitalistic cancer. It's early, but get away from cancer and good things start to happen. In any case, I find it pretty interesting that in 2010, absolutely everyone was convinced that QE was going to be inflationary. And now that the global monetary authorities have printed $20 trillion worth of liquidity, no one thinks it can happen. Now, after they've argued that the Fed is going back to QE, that Trump wants low rates, that the U.S. Treasury won't be able to sell bonds, and that there is no inflation, there is still one other argument that I often hear. And that is that even if funding is provided to them, that the world is tapped out and will no longer borrow, especially at higher rates. And that brings me to an iconic duo of another sort. Robert Giffen and Thorstein Veblen, two renegade economists who broke the laws of economics. Now, how did they do this? Well, they theorized that under certain circumstances, that the demand for goods would not rise when the price of the good fell, but rather demand would rise when the price of the good rose. Now, they theorized that this would happen for different reasons and for the different types of goods. Giffen goods are often seen as being a necessity or a staple of consumer purchases, whereas a Veblen good would entail a luxury item, where demand would increase with price mainly because of the status it conferred upon the purchaser. Now, I'm of the opinion that money, and maybe even debt in certain situations, is the ultimate Giffen good. And as I was working on this argument, I was pleased to find that I was not alone in another one of my crazy ideas. In fact, I found a number of articles, papers, blog posts, some that go as far back as the 70s, which lay out this very premise. This post from the Political Calculations blog I thought summarized my thinking very succinctly, so I'll draw upon this and explain it in greater detail. 3 necessary preconditions are needed in order for something to qualify as a Giffen good. First, the good in question must be seen as an inferior good. Second, there must be a lack of close substitutes. And finally, the good must constitute a substantial percentage of the buyer's income. An inferior good is typically one that is a lower priced option, such as products found at Walmart rather than Saks Fifth Avenue, or like taking a bus rather than taking a plane. And as such, if you move up your income bracket, you buy less of these products and instead buy more of the higher priced products. And as it relates to debt, we can see by this chart that a family's leverage ratio, or their purchase of debt as a percentage of their budget, does tend to drop as their income rises. So far, this would qualify as a Giffen good. Next, we need to see if there are any available substitutes. Now, this is pretty straightforward. It's really just choosing one sweetener over another or buying Coke instead of Pepsi. Now, if we look at the same chart again, but just focus on the top-end earners, we can see that the leverage ratio falls. This means that these families are in fact choosing alternatives, whether they are buying things with cash or just choosing not to consume a higher number of items. However, lower income earners don't have the same options of acquiring other goods or substitutes, and a bigger portion of their paycheck goes for things that they need, not the things that they want. In other words, the poor and the middle class don't have the same substitution options as the top 1%. So in certain circumstances, based on the first two criteria, debt, or the access to money, still qualifies as a Giffen Good. Finally, the third qualification is that the good constitutes a substantial portion of the buyer's income. Probably not surprisingly, here we can see that the top earners, the amount of debt to income falls dramatically. But again, for lower earners, the cost of debt or the access to money accounts for as much as 20% of their total income. I'd say that qualifies as substantial. In other words, for a certain portion of the population, and under the right circumstances, money is indeed a Giffen Good. And as such, demand will not fall as the price rises, it will rise. And to me, this just makes common sense. Unless you're going to resort to barter, you need money, regardless of its cost. So I don't buy the argument that just because interest rates rise, the demand for debt will fall. I'm sure that sounds good in the computer models and mahogany paneled offices of central banks, but not in the real world where someone is trying to feed their son, send their daughter to college, or fund their new business. And the idea that people will stop borrowing when they get in a tight spot, just because rates are higher, I think is very naive. When people get desperate, or to the end of their rope, that is when they will pay the highest rate imaginable. I mean, loan sharks are not exactly known for keeping rates near the zero bound, and the idea of negative rates I'm sure doesn't even compute with them. And what about credit cards? Take a look at the average interest rate on credit cards going back 10 years. The lowest annual percentage rate on this page is almost 12%. Considering that the federal funds rate is less than 2%, I'd say that qualifies as pretty high. So if high rates are such a detriment to borrowing, can someone please explain to me this chart of the stock price for Visa? I don't claim to be the smartest guy in the world, but I'm told that up and to the right is a good thing. So how are they able to rack up profits if no one is willing to borrow with rates at 12%? The last argument I always hear about is de-dollarization. And yes, of course this is taking place. The rest of the world hates the dollar. They hate the way that the US wields it. They hate the whole system. And they are working furiously to come up with some new plumbing to bypass it. So yes, some liquidity can flow there. In the secondary and the black markets, there's always a way to get business done. But it's hard, it's slow, it's expensive, and if you get caught, it hurts your chances of getting invited back to the system that everyone else uses. Because efforts so far are the basic equivalent of attaching a garden hose versus everyone else's using a system like the one in the picture here. I constantly hear about how China, Russia, Turkey, and Iran are bypassing the dollar system. Well, if their bypass works so well, why aren't they doing more of it? And if their economies are able to flourish under this bypass system, why do their national currencies look like this? And why don't they do more? So, I mean, the fact is that their currencies continue to fall. If this bypass system was working, they would be doing more and their economy should reflect it. Next, people will tell me that gold can provide a very simple and elegant solution. Well, of course it can. Why on earth do you think I've been pounding the table on gold for the last several years? Of course gold will work. Of course it will save the few people that have it when the dollar pipes start to break in a few years. But regardless of the fact, the rest of the world is not ready for it. They don't believe it. And until the rest of the world believes it, it doesn't matter how many of us repeat gold's advantages. Listen, I get the total de-dollarization story. It is happening. It will happen further. But this only addresses trade going forward. It does nothing to solve the debt that has already been borrowed in the past. And even if it did, a new global monetary system is not yet ready to go. And that's a problem, because time has run out. This US dollar leverage you see here is due now. This is no longer an event out in the economic future. The debt is due right now. We are in it, and it is only getting worse for EM moving forward. Now, there is tremendous pressure on both dollars and gold to move higher as a result of all this. They are both like beach balls that are being held underwater. And when the pipes break and our monetary mandarins start to lose control, they will both move higher together. The reason beach balls held underwater have the potential to be explosive is, again, not surprisingly, due to the power of fluids put under pressure. The upward force on the beach ball is equal to the weight of the fluid that it displaces, and water is much heavier than air. This is also why it's so hard to control a ball when it's held underwater. One of the things I find most interesting regarding the pop-up effect of a ball held underwater is that it doesn't actually pop higher if you pull it down lower. This is because the weight of all the water on top of it affects it in several different ways. Vortexes can form, a wake may exert some drag on it, it may move sideways rather than straight up. Balls that are pushed way down might only slowly rise back to the surface, but rise they will. But a ball that is held just slightly below the water and that is released closer to the surface doesn't have the weight of the water on top of it and will normally make a much bigger pop when released. Maybe this helps explain why gold has been so subdued. It got pushed down 30% underwater in 2013. And ever since it's bobbed up and down, but the weight of the water has kept it from breaking out with any real force or speed. But the dollar, the market forces were only able to push it down a little bit. And unless they get control of it very quickly, it's going to break the surface in a ferocious release of pressure. Now, truth be told, this is what already happened in the last 3 months. And as such, it has used up some of its energy. So in the very short term, a short little pull lower might actually help the dollar build up the energy it needs to break through 100. And in the very short term, gold is oversold, and based on the same effects we just discussed, it is due for a bounce. With sentiment below 10, RSI below 20, and the commercial shorts now covering their contracts furiously, we should see a rally. But the remainder of the year is really going to depend on the dollar. All markets are really just a trade around the dollar and its knock-on effects right now. But once the pipes start to break, which they will, gold will begin to make its move and join the dollar on stage, and they will ultimately rise together. Now, this is nothing less than the perfect storm. You have every factor you need in place for a short squeeze on the ultimate Giffen Good. I honestly don't know how a more potential short squeeze could be engineered, even if we set out to do so. The knock-on effects will shock almost everyone, probably even those of us who are expecting it to happen. The whole world needs dollars. Even if they don't want them, they still need them. And the dollars are no longer being manufactured, and they are no longer being exported. Things are severely under pressure, and investors are going to need an iconic duo if they want to get through it. I still expect the dollar to break out first, but both assets are going to play critical roles in the concert the market puts up over the next few years. But regardless, dollars and gold are quite a pair. Freddie Mercury and the dollar. Huge, pompous, overbearing rock stars who were both destined to die an early death. But before he went, Freddie sang the note heard around the world, and in the process became a legend. And before the dollar dies, which it most definitely will, it is going to leave its mark on everyone's life, and no one living through it will ever forget it. Bowie and gold. In his own way, I think even more powerful than Mercury. He was no less confident, he was quieter, happy to do his own thing. But like gold, he's timeless. You could move him 500 years into the past or 500 years into the future, and I think he would feel right at home. Now, despite their great collaboration, Bowie and Mercury never actually performed Under Pressure together on stage. But the words they wrote almost 50 years ago would still enthrall a crowd today. In a way, you could say the song is about money and the pressure it puts you under. That's what we've been talking about here today. But it was really much more than that. I really think it was much more about how pressure makes us treat each other. And while I'd like to say the world has taken their best piece of advice, it'd be very hard to make that argument. So here's my request to you. Give love a chance in your little part of the world. Maybe, just maybe, it'll catch on. As always, I'm happy to discuss any of this info put in here in more detail. Just let me know. Happy to discuss. Thanks for listening.